Good afternoon, Mr. Bradbury.
Good afternoon.
In the context of the conference that is underway on lifelong management of dyslexia, when dyslexia is not diagnosed and treated early on, learning disorders such as including dyslexia can adversely affect the adolescent and adults' social emotional adjustment and their self-worth and self-esteem. These outcomes can severely handicap their ability to be successful in life socially, academically, vocationally, and so on. The difficulty in time management, memorizing, adjusting to change are some of the symptoms seen in adult behavior. Lack of motivation and inability to sustain relationships also manifest themselves in different behavioral patterns. So today's interaction with you are a well-known, a very well qualified and experienced adult, child and family therapist who specializes in working with children and adults in behavioral assessments. So in today's context with the conference, we would like you to share some experience with us. With this introduction, let me begin with, how does learning disability affect relationships between peers and members of the family?
I think with early intervention being the key, and assuming that it all goes well, that the people in a position to identify is something developmentally gone awry in their children. It would be mom and dad in other family. It might be teachers, for example. It might be the pediatrician. To identify something and get a screening done and then a subsequent assessment to refine the diagnosis if there is one, to really determine what it is about this child developmentally that we can intervene and we can help. As a way to forestall the unfortunate, manifestations in adolescence or adulthood that you mentioned with an undiagnosed dyslexic, or in my profession, more commonly, someone who might be on the spectrum of autism, or might be experiencing a mood disturbance, or might have suffered a loss and have unresolved grief and mourning, or maybe even experienced a trauma. Early intervention is clearly the key in all of that.
What ways do these frustrations or inadequacies in an adolescent or adult manifest in behavior?
With children, you would see acting out behavior. They're very high energy typically, given their ages. And if something is not right developmentally, they're likely to communicate that through their behavior. All behavior communicates something, and if a child is under some sort of duress or distress in their life, that's going to be manifested behaviorally. It may be verbally, depending on the child and their ability to put into words what their inner experience is. Not all children can do that. In my work as a therapist, I use play therapy a great deal, and play is the language of children, as I think we can all agree. My training has equipped me with the ability to interpret a child's play and to identify some of the struggles that they may be experiencing.
Can you share an experience or two where behavioral problems were successfully managed in both personal as well as in their professional lives?
Yeah. Again, with children, the acting out behavior isn't restricted to the home. It comes to school, right. And schools need a certain bit of order in order to run the classroom effectively to the benefit of all the children. So if there are one or two that are acting out behaviorally, they quickly come to the attention of helping professionals like myself by way of a referral for some sort of disruptive behavior disorder. Maybe the teacher is calling it attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity. Well-meaning, well well-intentioned, but not qualified to make such a diagnosis. So they are very good at referring then to the pediatrician, who may in fact then refer to me or another, psychotherapist.
Anything specific in terms of an experience of at the adulthood?
The workplace, for example.
Workplace, yes.
What we've talked about in the conference so far, many of the speakers have touched on the impact of functioning for an untreated or unresolved dyslexic. Going to the workplace and, being disorganized, for example, was a hallmark symptom. Being late for meetings or missing deadlines, these kind of things that the workplace, really calls upon us to do consistently. And the dyslexic person who doesn't have appropriate accommodations or hasn't experienced and received treatment may then be at a disadvantage in the workplace.
Interesting. Sort of that leads me to the next question. Again, relating to workplace, as you just mentioned, the difficulty in adjusting to change, because change is generally scary for everyone, and there is a normal tendency, as they say, resistance to change.
Yes.
But for people with learning disabilities and other neurological disabilities, change may be particularly difficult. For example, adults with learning disabilities will experience change in more subtle ways in terms of adjusting to change. Some adults will have trouble moving from one work task to another, finishing the task on time, and you said going to meetings late. They're also perceived to be sort of inflexible when it comes to considering another person's point of view or a different way of doing something. In this context, have you experienced in your interactions with people at the adulthood in terms of their difficulty and how do they cope with change?
Well, that's just it. They've learned how to cope, and a lot of times they have arrived at those coping skills on their own, without the help of professional or certainly a sympathetic supervisor or boss at work who understands it and says, okay, well, let's do it this way instead. It seems to be more consistent with your way of being in the world, in our workplace. They become rigid because they've found a system that works for them but doesn't necessarily work for the workplace or the home environment or even the community. So they become more rigid as a way to preserve an already fragile sense of self and the self-esteem because they've always either identified themselves as different since childhood or been labeled as different. Lazy, maybe stupid, maybe made to feel less than because adequate screening and assessment hadn't been done, a proper diagnosis hadn't been arrived at, and proper interventions haven't been brought to bear.
Or is help available at the workplace in terms of any therapy or counseling sessions to enable these employees to cope and sort of improve on the areas that they need to improve?
A sympathetic boss or supervisor would be wonderful,
right,
but all bosses and supervisors are not sympathetic,
right,
and maybe unaware of the dynamics going on for the individual who is struggling. They just want a good employee who's reliable and consistent and they can count on. In America, we have something called the Employee Assistant Program,
right,
and what that does is provides an early intervention to identify some sort of problem with an employee, whether it's substance abuse or depression or some such thing that is adversely impacting the workplace. So they have a counselor meet with the employee for 1 to 3 sessions to try to do a screening and assessment to get to the root cause of what's going on. And then if there is something treatable that the person can diagnose properly, they can refer out for more long-term therapy to resolve the problem. In India, I'm not sure that such a thing exists. Perhaps in some of the bigger companies it does. But I think awareness on the part of the average citizen, who are the same people that work in companies, whether in the capacity of a boss or the employee, that there are struggles that humans have, whether it's a learning disability, substance abuse, or a mood disturbance.
That's interesting. I have read, there are some myths about learning disabilities, and therefore it has led to sort of public's sort of general negative perception about the learning disability.
Yeah, yeah.
For example, a myth is people with learning disabilities have below average intelligence and cannot learn.
But we know.
But
a
what is the
learning-
fact?
But a learning disability has nothing to do with intelligence, right?
Right.
That we know as professionals and having acquainted ourselves with the research. But just the public at large is unaware, by and large, of the research and, what it even means to be dyslexic or dyscalculic or any type of learning disability, or even to have a mood disturbance. We think it might be a failing of character. In America, 30 or 40 years ago, that was the prevailing wisdom, that it's a failing of character. You're depressed, or God forbid you have a learning disability, you'd be labeled lazy or stupid or something like that.
Right.
That was totally erroneous, but there was no research awareness or no helping professionals trying to spread the word and elevate people's awareness and understanding, and therefore empathy for their coworkers, their family members, their friends who are struggling with a learning disability or some such thing.
Maybe similarly on the same lines, another myth which needs to be demystified is learning disabilities only affect children. Adults grow out of learning disabilities.
But we know that is untrue also, right? And again, it's an awareness thing. And yesterday I was really, it was really lovely to see a number of people bring up parent initiatives of parents of children with dyslexia or a learning disability, having availed themselves of available resources to help their child, coming together separate from those formal interventions and having mutual support and discussing, their experiences and feeling better about themselves. Because we forget the half of the equation with children is the parents need to be really well equipped emotionally to deal with the demands of a dyslexic or a learning disabled child. If the parent is struggling in some capacity in their own life, they're not going to be as strong an advocate for their child. They're not going to be able to mobilize services for their child, which are available.
Sure.
And if a parent is not fully, hasn't fully accepted the fact that their child is different, is disabled in some manner, whether it's learning disability, mood disturbance, or some such thing, then they've got to overcome that sense of grief. And if that's unresolved, that's going to continue to be feeding guilty feelings in the parent. And that's going to, make it difficult for them to really consistently advocate for their child who's never going to outgrow dyslexia. That's
Right.
always going to be a part of their life. And eventually they'll leave the family. But if they've had good support and they've had a parent who really stepped up and was there for them in that way, they can then pick up the ball and run with it into adulthood and have self-advocacy and a
Right.
feeling of confidence as opposed to poor self-esteem and hopelessness.
Right. Another one is adults with learning disabilities cannot succeed in higher education.
Albert Einstein had dyslexia. Is that not true? Right? And many,
many
very
cases.
famous people that we've heard of. And they're not special. The average person who's an adult dyslexic can function at a high level and succeed, as far as their potential will take them. But they have to have support. They have to have, empathetic others around them. They have to have the motivation.
Yes.
There are parts that need to be in place for them to do that, but that all starts in childhood. And if that is their experience throughout their childhood and adolescence, then it's very hopeful that the outcome in adulthood is going to be much more positive.
You mentioned the word motivation. The lack of motivation, how do dyslexic in adulthood handle that?
One thing we haven't talked about yet is that these kind of disabilities don't happen in isolation.
Right.
Oftentimes there's a corresponding mood disturbance with dyslexia. Imagine the child who is dyslexic, who has struggled mightily through the early grades of school, who have parents and even the teachers that have seen him through the grades, unaware that might be at work. So didn't refer for screening and assessment and diagnosis and intervention, but pushed the child through, and the child has muddled along, all the while suffering more and more attacks on his self-esteem, poor feelings about himself, with the primary dyslexia, and now an emerging mood disturbance. Right? So when you talk about motivation, a depressed person doesn't have a high degree of motivation. That's one of the things that suffers when you're depressed, right? So motivation is hostage to that. But there could be any number of other variables at work too, because no disability is happening in a vacuum. There are all these intervening variables at work, mood disturbance just being one of a number, that could impact one's motivation.
Feel ashamed of the type of difficulties they are struggling to cope with. It could be basic literacy skills, slow processing, attention difficulties, chronic forgetfulness, ability to work in a team, and organizational difficulties, and so on and so forth. What is your advice to such people at the workplace?
Again, it's an awareness from the grassroots level up. And again, it takes decades for that to happen. We've got, a wave of children, 3 to 5 years old now. We're identifying among that cohort, who has dyslexia, who has learning disability. We know now to bring the screening and assessment process to bear. We know now to get proper diagnosis and intervention and make the proper accommodations so they have an experience of success through the school years. And then they reach adolescence when, identity is a big issue on the front burner, peer relationships are a big issue, and they begin to pull away from the family a little bit and gravitate more towards the peer group. But if they've had that experience of empathic support of others, helping them with their learning, and they feel good about themselves, then they're going to be better able to advocate for themselves. And again, if this cohort, is pretty much cohesive in terms of the parental awareness to access these services, and the children experience that, there's going to be a widening of awareness, again, from the grassroots on up. And then these children who become adolescents, who become young adults, are the emissaries carrying that forward, as we talked about. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, but eventually you get there. But you have to be persistent, and you have to stay at it. And here in India, what I've experienced so far is that is well underway.
Yes, very true, because I have come across and read about many such cases where they've had to sort of struggle in their school and haven't taken certain remedial action and remedial learning. They have been put back into mainstream school where they have done well, and then they have gone ahead with their graduation, and in many cases even post-graduation. And we've heard a lot of success stories of students who have passed out, doing very well in different spheres of life, whether it is running their own small businesses, hotel management, media, anything which is sort of creative in advertising and so on, in arts, photography. I mean, these are all the areas where people have excelled.
Absolutely.
Although they have had a very difficult time in their school. So obviously, as they have progressed, a lot of career opportunities have opened for them, and they have done very well. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, 100%. I think there's a drive to achieve and to do our very best. And that drive is hampered only when we're struggling with something organic that goes unnoticed, goes undiagnosed. We don't get the proper accommodations and treatment to facilitate our development and striving for those achievements and that optimal human functioning, if you will. So I think that the more we do that, and the more on the grassroots level on up, the awareness becomes commonplace, just part of the discourse, then, that bodes very well for future generations. But it's got to start somewhere.
Right. So, while the child goes through these different phases, right from schooling into educational system, into workplace, and so on and so forth, and while the child is making progress, what would your advice be to parents who would play, I would imagine, a very significant role in the development of the child.
Yeah, bravo to the parents who step up and know that. We all love our kids. We bring kids into this world out of love. They're there, they represent, they are the embodiment of our love. That should carry the day. However, there are the real world demands on the parents, the real world demands on the child. And sometimes even the best, most well-informed, well-intentioned parents aren't able to do their best because of these other circumstances at work. But if there's a cohort large enough, generationally now, that whole wave of 3 to 5 year olds coming into the world now, then there's that opportunity for mutual support, getting back to what was talked about in yesterday's lectures about parent groups, just, kind of springing up,
Sharing experiences.
Absolutely. There's nothing better than that, because now we're talking about a shared lived experience. I'm a professional. I can be involved in helping a family with a dyslexic child who might have some anxiety and some, hyperactivity issues. But I'm a marginal part of their lived experience. Other parents who go home to a child in the same circumstances much more closely approximates that lived experience. And those people coming together, I think, are going to carry the day.
Great. Positive note, Mr. Bradbury. Thank you very much for sharing your insights. And I'm sure the listeners, the parents, and public at large would be greatly benefited from the value of your experience and insights. Any closing comments from your side?
I just want to say it's a pleasure to be able to participate in this conference and to give this interview. And I think that one thing that I bring to my work as a professional therapist and my role as a parent and just a human being is a great deal of passion and enthusiasm for life.
Right.
And we have no greater obligation than to the lives we bring into the world, our
Right.
children. And I know all the parents love their kids, and I know all the parents are doing their very best. But coming together, and accessing these resources and accessing the shared experiences of others is really going to feed that and keep that going. And it's going to bode well for the future.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.